Yes, Bambos, you're jazzed up. You're like, you ran up here. Little does anyone know, like we stalled the minute so that you could get up from your
3
job
minutes,
now.
Andy. 3 minutes.
4 minutes right now, I see. We're on today with David Boone. I've known David Boone for some time. He was on a series. It wasn't a series. It was a documentary called The Ivory Tower on CNN that won some awards. He, became a little bit of, for lack of a better word, his story was prostituted out a lot because it sounded so good. Homeless to Harvard, the two H's. And so we are going to talk to him on the show a bit about that experience, a bit about how it is also to move past that.
So we're going to prostitute him too.
Exactly.
I love it.
And we're going to talk to him about that and be honest about it and laugh and enjoy ourselves a bit. And
we're going to do that, Andy, on?
Let me get to the damn thing, that was a wonderful chaos.
We love our tune, don't we, Andy?
Yeah, we do love it. We do love it.
Andy.
Yes.
I'm having a great time.
Geez.
Every morning.
When did that happen? Tell me what happened.
I'm listening to our podcast every day.
Uh-huh.
And it's such a joy, especially our intros.
Yeah.
I can listen to them on repeat and I just laugh my ass off.
Yeah, me too. Me too. There's something about, like, Ronnie, I think she's wondering, when I go downstairs, we're lying in bed, I just want to listen to our intro because somehow it just makes me feel good. And she's like, you just did that. Why would you watch it again?
There's something terribly wrong. But the reason I'll do it is because there's so much substance sometimes in the most mundane of talk shows.
Yeah.
Even in the way that you will give me feedback sometimes, that I get to learn and deepen my own experience.
Yeah. I mean, when I've listened to the shows back, I've learned a lot of things, and I've even changed my behavior. I have a hard time now hearing myself say the word like. There was one show I said the word like 100 times, and every time I was driving in the car, I was like, oh, there's a good. Stop it.
Like.
Yeah, that's what happens when you listen to the old shows. You're like, if I knew that earlier, I would have changed it.
I'll pinch you for every like you say.
So, David Boone.
Andy.
David Boone comes from mutual friend Jeff McClellan. Jeff is someone I've worked with for many years. Start Soul is the program. It's an incredible free program that we've delivered throughout the U.S., starting in Cleveland. If you don't know it, startsoul.org. And David Boone is now working closer with Jeff. So they also have some more projects, and we'll get into that as well. I was always fascinated with David because I have had very little influence in lives of poverty. I haven't had exposure to poverty in my life. The only time I had it, I wrote about it in the last letter. And I don't know if you remember when I worked in a factory in Detroit. And I worked in the factory in Detroit, and my aunt and uncle were very wealthy, and they owned the factory, or he owned it. And when I worked there, they wanted me to sort of work on all these different areas, but I really wanted to work in the sort of most mundane, most intense area. Like intense, when I say intense, like people were stabbed in that area. It wasn't a simple place to work. And there were these talks I would have with the people. And as I was sitting there, I looked at this one guy and I said, I have a weird question for you. Did you, I said maybe from the age of like 14, I knew that I was going to go to college. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, Andy, from the age of 14, I knew I was never going to go to college. And what happened to me was there was this weird, like, it was like, and it's ever evolved since then. Like how many things in my life was I not aware were programmed from my environment that I got the benefit from? And how would it have been if I was in another environment where the programming was totally different? And this is what I saw in this friend that I had on the on the work floor there in the factory.
Wow.
And the whole idea is, you know, when there's those beautiful videos where they show, you know, what is privilege look like, and then they'll say, you know, how many people had to suffer from 5 or 10 different disadvantages, and then there's people that are kind of at the end and others that haven't even had an opportunity to start yet. And I've been utterly fascinated and humbled by the fact that that I have gotten so much privilege in my life. And when I speak to someone like David, who hasn't necessarily had that privilege, then I sit in sort of an awe and a fascination, because I can't understand what that life would have looked like. So when I've talked to him through the years, there's always been a deep, and I haven't asked him some questions because it felt like, you know, what am I going to dig in? Like, hey, dude, how, you know, but I thought now that we're on the show, it's a more of a suitable kind of platform to have those discussions.
You're going to unleash yourself on him, aren't you?
Well, I mean, I asked him, like I always ask everyone, what can we not talk about, you know?
Oh, is there anything we can't talk about?
No, it was all good.
Good.
And I'll pinch you if you do. Yeah. By the way, you asked a question yesterday. I just want to make sure we go back to that. You were really direct in the question with the guests yesterday. The first question you asked, we'll go back to it. You watch on the video, and then she didn't answer your question.
I saw that.
Okay, and you know why she didn't?
Yeah.
Why? I'm testing you now. Because it was too direct.
It was too direct.
Yeah.
And she really, I saw that she went like this, but
Yeah.
she came back to it later.
She
but
did.
in
She
different
did.
context.
So I wanted to tell you, we've got to kiss them before we go to bed with them. Okay. So that's the lesson from yesterday's show.
Don't want to kiss David, but he does have long hair.
He does. So we are going to bring on David Boone on the show. Thank you.
You guys are hilarious.
Yeah, I was telling, I didn't know if I tell Bombos, but when he posted, there were about 60 people that liked the post he was coming on. And I thought, do they really know what show you're coming on to? You know, have they figured that out yet?
And look, man, every conversation I have with you is great. So now I'm just letting an audience join us. How about that?
Yeah, that sounds. You know, the one thing that was really nice when we were preparing for this show was
that we didn't prepare.
Well, when we prepare for the title of the show, basically we always prepare a title. Other than that, things kind of unfold. But for the title of the show, you know, I always go for this lowest common denominator to get people in. Just why not pick something that's salacious and interesting that people might want to watch? So when I came and I basically proposed it to David, I said, we'll do the Homelss to Harvard thing. And he was reacted to it like, and which I really liked. He was like, Andy, you know, once we identify these things and we use the word when we sensationalize them, then we lose track that there's some deeper seated meaning behind those words. It becomes a concept. And then it was really nice because there were so many other words that he said, Andy, and he didn't say this in direct words, we'll get to it, but it was like, Andy, there's so many other identities and they keep being labeled and stuck on me over and over again, that in some ways embracing them is part of the journey, but also seeing that it's all bullshit is another part of the journey.
Yeah.
And that was really nice because I love when you came back, I'm like, oh my God, he's right. This is horrible. and weirdly necessary to get people maybe interested in watching. Promoting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all about the promotion, right? You said it earlier, prostituting, pimping. I've had the story on every major news outlet, whatever, and most of the time the benefit to me was pretty small. But you know, what I came to learn is that there's other value in it outside of like, you know, personal benefit or sort of experience. And I'd love to talk more about that, but you know, as we go.
Yeah. And that's something that I find really beautiful. And that's one thing I discovered in my own life is that and I always use this word because it's the lingo that I've now got with books, is that once you have a platform, you can do whatever you want on that platform.
Yeah, exactly. You leverage it the way you want to leverage it. It's the foundation to build whatever house your dreams see fit.
Yeah, but I think it might take people some time to embrace the thing that maybe earlier was perceived as the negative.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think with me, especially with the whole Homelss to Harvard thing, I had to keep telling myself that this isn't for me. And it's something my mom actually helped me with. She sort of said, you haven't been brought this far to be left, right? And really, from a religious context, there's this, saying in Christianity of like, God wouldn't bring you this far to leave you. And so the whole idea was like, there's some reason you're going through whatever it is you're going through, right? And so the homelessness and so forth, there's some reason you're doing it. And when it got to a point where I was into all these great schools and life was starting to take shape, and people were writing about it all over the web, some people telling lies, some people telling the truth. We can talk about that too. I started to realize why it was important. And it's because there are, millions of homeless teens worldwide who are trying to find their inspiration for a way out. And I was brought back to those sort of activating instances where I was inspired, and it changed my mind enough that I didn't make another bad decision, right? I mean, because I've made some bad decisions along the way. I've done some things I'm not proud of. You can call it survival, whatever. Well, for whatever reason, I've done some things that I'm not necessarily proud of.
Yeah.
But I've been fortunate that none of those things have been, path ending, right? Because they can be. Mistakes can be really hard to come back from, especially growing up in poverty. And so, knowing that, I sort of kept that in the back of my mind. It's like, yes, like they're perverting this story. They're making it something that it's not. But someone's going to see this who can really use it and who it's going to mean more for than it even means. And so my mom really helped me to keep that perspective in the times where I was like, Mom, they're calling you a drug addict. You've never been on drugs,
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, because they needed to create the story so that it. Oh, and if the story was true to form, it wouldn't have been as appealing.
Exactly. It was again, pimp out.
Well, David.
Yes.
So I know nothing about you. I just jumped on.
Oh, okay.
Can you in like 1 minute just share with
down.
me? Yeah, a little bit.
Most definitely. So, I grew up here in Cleveland. Actually, I'm back in Cleveland. That's something I want to talk about later. But I grew up here in Cleveland. My mom had me when she was 16 years old. At that time, she had my older sister already, who was a year older than me. And she was also taking care of her little brother, who at the time was like 14. And this actually sort of came to be because my grandmother was a drug addict, right? And so my mom had to fundamentally step up and sort of lead the family very, very young. She dropped out of high school, got her GED, and started working, and she's worked every day since. And so the environment that I grew up in was like, my mom would come in late from work, and it was me, and by the time we really got old enough to be with it, it was five. There are five of us, and so me and my older sister and then our three younger siblings were just like, running the house while my mom was going out and making money so that we could be as comfortable as you can be growing up, on government assistance and so forth. But grew up in the city with my four siblings. We just looked out for each other. We were really close. Always went to the same school, so always had sort of a tribe up until high school. And for a long time, I was a smart kid that just wasn't living up to his potential. I actually ran into one of my middle school science teachers, and she asked me, "Are you still having those problems?" And I didn't know what she was talking about. She was like, "Your behavioral issues." And I was like, "Huh? Like you thought I had behavioral issues?" I was just a smart ass. Like I didn't think I had behavioral issues. But I was, again, always a kid that if I wasn't engaged, I didn't try, right? I skipped class probably 80% of the time in middle school, if I'm being honest. I got C's when I should have been getting A's. Like they couldn't fail me because I would always pass the test, but I just didn't. I thought homework was a conspiracy. I thought it was like programming. Like I was just a weird kid that just didn't believe in much. And then when I was in 8th grade, I applied to a very special school, MC Square STEM, which actually Jeff, who is our mutual connection, Andy, founded, that, really sparked my entry. It was project-based. It was about inquiry-based learning. It was a different model. It was no longer this model of a teacher is in control of your learning and you just sort of have to run along the regimen, run along the path, and you don't have any influence in it. It was very much self-directed, more you come and bring who you are. And it allowed me to be David and be a learner and be a great student. And I went from, almost failing math and being held back in 8th grade to a straight A student. And eventually, from this public school of a very small class, ended up getting into, I think it was 22 out of 23 colleges I applied to, MIT being my top choice and the only one I didn't get into. But all things happen for a reason. And so ended up choosing Harvard and studying computer science there before joining Microsoft and now becoming an entrepreneur.
Yeah. Wow.
So when was the homeless part?
The homeless part was starting in high school. And so that's the part that we'll probably spend enough time on. But, when I was 14 years old, well, I'll go back to 13. When I was 13 years old, we actually had an opportunity to move out of the government housing projects. There's this local housing program in Cleveland that allows low-income families to have an opportunity to own a home. And so we moved out of the projects into this sort of rent-to-own situation, but it was in a completely different neighborhood. And when you grow up in these environments, you learn how to navigate your neighborhood, your environment. And so I was never someone who was affiliated with any cliques or gangs or otherwise. I was always sort of, the nerdy David that just kind of stayed out of the way. And people respected that in the neighborhood that I grew up in. And so I never really had many challenges navigating, if something was going down, people just, they left me out of it, which I always appreciated growing up. But I didn't realize how important that would be to my survival when I left. And so once I left that neighborhood and went into a new one, there were new rules to play by, right? And so, I was, trying to operate the same way where I'm playing football with these guys, basketball with these guys. I'm not thinking about any affiliation or who likes who. I never had to think about that growing up. And so, of course, at 13, I'm not thinking about it now. But it got to a point where these people were saying, hey, you're down with us or you're down with them. You need to pick. And I'm like, no, I'm not down with anyone. Like, I like to play football with you all and basketball with you all. We're all good. What's the problem here? But there, these mentalities and behaviors have become dominant. And so it got into a situation where my family wasn't on really good standings with any of the groups in the neighborhood. And there was an incident, with a friend of the family that ended up resulting in our house being shot at. And, the housing program sort of found out, immediately blamed us. This is circa 2008 as well, right, where the economy is starting to tank. And so right around the same time, we ended up getting evicted out of that place because of the violent act. And it was against some program rules or whatever, even though it wasn't something that we brought about. And, ultimately, my mom, ended up losing her job and so forth as a part of this sort of overall economic downturn. And my whole family ended up homeless. And so one of the other things that sort of has been diminished by the way the story has been told is it wasn't just me who experienced homelessness, right? Like I said, I have 4 other siblings, right? Yeah. At that point, I'm the second eldest and I'm 14 years old. My sister is 15. And then my younger sister is 12. My next youngest brother is 10. And the youngest of us is 6, right? And these are all children, like, very, very young children who, my mom did what she could. There's not a whole lot you can do in that situation. There aren't shelters for large families, right? Like it doesn't necessarily work that way. And so we ended up split up and just like, someone was with this friend of the family and someone was with that friend of the family. And that's how we sort of, dealt with the homelessness early on was we had to split up because the alternative is Children and Family Services gets involved and then you're split up anyway, but you don't know where the heck anyone is, right? You don't know where your 6-year-old sister is or where your 10-year-old brother is. And so, that is a much harder situation to manage as a 14-year-old for sure.
So did you, because I could imagine being in the sort of the older rungs, you would have, I could imagine, had some sense of responsibility to the younger ones, like as Absolutely. If you had to sort of take care of them at 14.
Absolutely. I mean, something that I think, one of the reasons I spoke about how my mom would work and we'd like maybe see her off in the morning and maybe see her coming home at night, that just like constantly working piece is important is because that meant that someone had to run the household. And so, I had my first job when I was 14 years old, being paid under the table to clean bathrooms and stock shelves in the mall, right? Like that was, a part of my responsibility as a man of the house. right? And my older sister did all the cooking and cleaning, making sure everyone got a bath. I mean, like very much we were, secretary or undersecretary of the state, as in terms of making, the household function, because, if someone needed to do it. And so that didn't change once the household left, right? That we still had those responsibilities. We just had them in different ways. And so one of the responsibilities I had was just to make sure that everyone was good and comfortable. And so, I went to visit at the different places people were staying to just check in and, call them whoever they were staying with. But, my situation was a little bit more fluid. I didn't have a one place that I was going. I would stay with a friend for a little bit and maybe stay at my grandmother's place for a little bit. But obviously she couldn't support a teenage boy that well either. And so I just kind of hopped around for probably about a year and a half, before, any real stability came into play, all while entering into my first year of high school. Pretty critical time, right? A lot of change happening. But you know what? In some ways, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me, because guess what? I couldn't control anything else but school, right? School is the one arena where I had some sense of control over what happened with my life, and so I focused really hard on being the best student I could be, and while the rest of my life was in chaos. And that actually ended up being something that shaped and transformed the future.
When you were going to school that freshman year, were people aware of your situation, or did you sort of hide it and just sort of just figure out a way to, because I mean, the school would have said, they would have asked you, what address do you have? Like, what address would you have given them?
I gave them my grandmother's address. And so, I had sort of a whole story, so to speak, right? It's like almost like growing up a spy or something. You get like this identity that you wear. This is how my life works, and this is where I live, and this is my address, and you can kind of spew it off. And here's her phone number. And so I had that constructed, and to be clear, this is something I learned pretty young. You learn that children, like if a teacher or a principal or anyone in the school environment believes that there is something going wrong at home, they have a responsibility by law to report it. And so, growing up in a situation where like sometimes my brother did wear a dirty shirt to school or like whatever, because I mean, we were kids taking care of other kids, right? Like things happen that way. And these events happen, people come and inspect and things like that. You learn how to avoid that happening, right? You learn how to make sure that doesn't happen. And so by the time I was 14, I knew what to say, how to say it, and how to avoid having intervention, because, there are situations where intervention is the best thing. Our situation wasn't one of them. We as messed up as it was, the foster care system is way, way worse.
Yeah. I mean, it must have been horrific for your mom. And then, of course, for her to be thrown under the bus on the back end, as if the homelessness had only to do with something that had nothing to do with.
Right.
But I mean, she's now has all of you, and you're fending for yourself. It must have been torture for her.
I mean, yeah, it's been something that as a family we've had some time to discuss and talk about. But it's painful to think about, how that experience was for her. I mean, the helplessness, the powerlessness that she had to experience, and just, feeling like there wasn't, a lot that she could do, right? Like, again, the economy, it was just like folded. There are people who had even more stability than we had ever had, who are also facing the hardest times of their lives. And we were already on the line, right? We were already on the line to begin with. And so it was just a really difficult time to be in the situation that she was in as the parent, as the caregiver, as the sole breadwinner for the family. It took I think, fundamentally, it took a toll on all of us psychologically, but I think it definitely, really put her in a place that I don't think she would ever want to go back to. I can tell you that. In just terms of just like, again, the helplessness, and then, having people perceive it as something else is even more painful, right? To have people label it as a drug addicted mother, or someone who's just so reliant on the system, or whatever, the whole welfare queen thing. It's like, my mother's worked my whole life. It's never been that, but that's just how people, will associate the story, because, their own intentions, their own purposes. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, David.
Absolutely.
So I take it your father was not in the picture from the very beginning.
It's a complex situation there too, but yeah, I didn't actually really connect with my biological father until I was about 8 years old, and
Wow.
so at 14 we had a relationship, but I wouldn't call it like the strongest father-son relationship, and just in terms of responsibility, it just we didn't have that connection at that point in time, and so he did some things to help out along the way, but yeah, it wasn't I wouldn't call it a strong relationship at that point.
Yeah. I mean, are you now, how is your contact at the moment?
We've done a lot to repair the relationship, I would say, and that's been to a great credit of him, of just putting the investment in to repair that relationship. And that started when I was in high school. It did. That repair started in high school, but it's really gotten a lot better since.
Nice.
Yeah. So yeah, but so we have this situation, right, where we're all sort of separated, we're all trying to figure it out, and like I said, school was everything for me. It was like the one place where two things were true about school. It was a warm place during the day, and that had meals. I mean, that's a two-part one-pointer, and then the other piece was I could see a future in it. And when you're dealing with, this sort of homelessness situation where everything feels hopeless, right? The one little sliver of hope that you have is really important. And in fact, Jeff McClellan, once he sort of started to piece together what was going on in my life, he knew that something was up. He didn't know everything. He actually gave me a book called A Hope in the Unseen. And it was about a boy from DC, Cedric Jennings, who, just grew up in a single, his mother raised him by herself and went to, a regular public school, ended up at this summer program at MIT called Mites. And it like crushed him. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, but it was sort of eye-opening for him. And he ended up going on to study at Brown, and then I think U of M after that for a master's or a PhD. And so this gentleman, sort of had a very similar start. And then had these sort of things and these people who were interested in him along the way that sort of sparked him into a different trajectory than what would have been default, right? Because default would have been going to get, a job at, the Safeway or whatever the case may be, and living that life, which isn't a bad life, working and get your living. But he had this opportunity afforded to him. And at that point, I was like, I'm going to Mites. I didn't know anything about MIT. I'd never even heard of it. I was like, I'm going to the summer program. And this is me as a ninth grader. And I just started to speak things into existence. And by the time I was 11th grade and I was able to apply to Mites, I got in, I went, and it was exactly what I needed to be. It was an opportunity for me to connect with about 79 other students from all over the country, varying backgrounds, who were just as crazy to dream, just as big as I was dreaming. And they were doing it, right? It was like not just conversation, right? They were studying for the ACT. They were, getting the recommendations from the president. They were, they were doing all of the craziness that you need to do to apply to college in the U.S. And they became my community outside of, just the folks I grew up with who didn't necessarily dream a dream that large, right? And didn't have really the scope of exposure to dream that large, So so they really became a great community for me.
When you say that, there's a few items that popped in my head as you were talking, but one of them was like, it's interesting because when I want to change or alter something in my life, then I alter the environment I'm in because those people show me the other norm. It's like, there's another way of living. They all share this kind of weird common understanding that's so foreign to me, and yet it seems real to them. It's almost like it's like traveling to another country. That's why it's so important to have that. And I just think it's fascinating, and it makes all the sense in the world that going to that environment gave you a whole nother perspective on what was possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can, like I said, sort of point to these inflection points along my journey that really helped to shape or just to expand my world. I tried to explain to someone, when I was, 14 years old and I was going through homelessness, my world still was so small that when I was talking to my best friend about our dreams were to like graduate high school, get a decent paying job, get a house in the neighborhood. And like, because our world was our neighborhood. It hadn't quite expanded to be bigger than that. And so, you know, we didn't know that we could be bold and say, no, maybe we want to go to college. Maybe we want to study medicine. Maybe we want to become doctors. Maybe we want to become engineers. We didn't have that frame of mind yet, right? And so this is my 8th grade year. This is like what's happening next is we're going to crush it in high school, and then we're going to, you know, go and get a great job. And again, nothing wrong with that, but it's just like it wasn't that we didn't want anything outside of that. We didn't know that we wanted something outside of that. And so, you know, there were different points where we just kind of got exposed to other opportunities, and that book was one. And I was like, I need to go to Mike's. I think it's going to be really important for me. And I was 100% right. And I went to this program. Like I said, I'm still friends with a lot of these folks today. Many of them were my classmates at Harvard when I went there. And so they became my community once I was there as well. Or they were at MIT right down the road. And I was able to sort of fellowship with them. And, you know, what was really important again about that community is I came back to Cleveland from this program, and it was an 8-week summer program. And my pace had went from snail to like turbocharged diesel engine. It was like I was, you know, as much horsepower as I could be putting into achieving my goals, I was putting it in. I mean, I think I took the ACT 4 or 5 times that semester because I was trying to inch out every single point I could inch out on this test so that I could get the best scholarship, because I knew if I wanted to go to these places, I couldn't afford it. And so I needed to make sure that I could apply for every merit-based scholarship that there was if I was going to achieve this goal, you know, while at the same time taking a full course load at a local university in Cleveland so that I can get a head start on the college courses so that even if I don't get a full ride, I don't have to spend 4 years there paying them, you know, something out of pocket. And so, you know, the whole mindset shift that took place by participating in that program was critical. I mean, it's absolutely critical.
Like, help me get this. Like, at your school, I'm gathering that you may have been the only one who's ever gone, or well, no, because you went to the MC squared, so I guess there would have been more that would have come out of there. So, but my question was something different. Was like, on how many people told you, "Oh, David, you're crazy." Like, how many people said, David, yeah, like, nice, I'm glad that you have these great dreams, but so how many people just like discouraged you from dreaming?
Yeah, a lot, and some pretty critical folks too, which is sad, you know, when I look back on it. But this is where someone like Jeff McClellan was extremely important in my development in my life and his investments outside of his own commitment as a principal, but really as someone who felt a responsibility to student success and not just a job of a principal. Because, you know, I had a guidance counselor who I came in with a score on the ACT. I think at that point, after this is probably my 2nd time or 3rd time taking a test. And so, you know, I've really inked out the points. I'm in like the 95th percentile. And so, you know, at the 95th percentile, you can apply to a lot of schools and have a reasonable expectation that you're going to get into it. Yeah. But their recommendation was that I apply to a state school that locally is known as the dropout factory, but apply to their honors program so that it'll be paid for. And that was what she was willing to support me in applying to, not like helping me to achieve what I had clearly communicated as a goal, but instead, this is the more realistic thing for you. Wow. Right. And this is what
let's slow down like that for a second. Like the guidance counselor who says, you're just dreaming too big. Let's get you in the dropout school, but put you in the honors program.
Yeah. And again, you really had the scores, right?
You really, when you think about it, you were already beyond that guidance counselor while they were guiding you.
I mean, I didn't know that then. But
no one does. Half the time you've gone beyond the individual you're with, it's like, oh, my dreams are bigger than you can even comprehend, you know? You're like thinking Harvard, where is that? Who would want to go to school like that? I don't know. Have you heard of it? I mean, that kind of crazy.
Yep. And you know, you like, again, this is when labels come in, right? Like, how many labels was she evaluating? So much so that she couldn't appreciate the person who was standing in front of her. Right. Like, how many of the things that she by default think of me were blocking her from seeing the person that I actually was, right?
Yeah.
The things that I'd actually accomplished. And, you know, it's really sad to say that that's the norm, right? And again, I feel extremely blessed and fortunate because, you know, Jeff was able to step in and say, man, we'll just find another guidance counselor, hire someone, you know, literally hired someone, you know, as a college consultant outside of the school district itself to work with our class, because, you know, that was the way that he had to work with the system he was given. Now, imagine me being in a school where that wasn't the case. Imagine what the outcomes would be if I couldn't get my guidance counselor to write a recommendation to Harvard. Right? Like that, like think about that, right? Like there would be no Homelss to Harvard story. Now, I might have still had a great career and a great life and all of these things, but I think there would have been a lot missed because I know for sure that the Harvard label, when you talk about labels, has opened so many doors for me. Yeah. And I feel blessed and fortunate. You talk about privilege earlier. I understand now that I have a level of privilege I didn't before, and it's just on me to leverage it. Privilege is not the problem. It's the lack of willingness to acknowledge your privilege. And then also on top of that, the lack of willingness to leverage that privilege for those who don't have it. And so that's where you have a problem. You know, you have to realize your privilege. And so, you know, I know that Harvard label is a privilege. It wouldn't have happened if I didn't have folks along the way to step in, to intervene and say, this isn't right. And I see David for who David is and not, you know, the kid that, you know, is coming to school funky a couple times or the kid that sometimes, you know, loses track of what he's saying and jumps off at a teacher, right? Because I did all those things. Again, I was a teenager. You know, I look back on it, I'm like, thank goodness no one just slapped me across the face.
I invited one of my high school teachers on the show, and I had to do a public apology because I was so
just like I appreciate you.
David, like there's one word which keeps vibrating really strongly in me, and that's the word love.
Yeah.
And so, because you had two choices growing up, you could have suppressed, but apparently you didn't suppress. And then the only way that could have happened is if you had access to love. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I like that you said that. Somewhere, you know, Facebook is going through all these evolutions. And recently I was just looking through my profile, and somewhere in high school or something like that, you know, I put on my status something like, you know, I was put on this planet to love. You know, God wouldn't have put all of us here if that wasn't the case, right? Like if God didn't want you to be connected to the people around you, he would have gave us all a star, right? we would have been kings of those stars or whatever the case may be. And like the world would be a different place for us. But you talk about love because, you know, I was trying to think like, who were the most influential people? Like who was the first person to really influence me in a meaningful way that I was cognizant of? Obviously, you pick up things sort of implicitly from the people around you by their example and so forth. But who like said something or did something that really like opened the world for me? And the first person was my mom, right? And, you know, I can think about the different instances, but the one that really pops out, my mom will give this example, is when I was in preschool or kindergarten. I went to preschool and kindergarten in the same place. So it was one of those years. So I was 4 or 5 years old. I came home from school and I said, Mom, I'm sick of playing with Chinese David. And she heard me say that. And she went, what? And mind you, if I'm 4 or 5, my mom's only 20 or 21. And my mother got up early that next day before her shift, walked into that school with me and her holding the hand, and gave my teachers an earful. And her reasoning for it was, you will not teach my son not to love someone else because of where they are from. You will not be calling him Black David, and you will not be calling him Chinese David. These are Davids. They're two boys. They're going to grow up. They can be friends. They cannot be friends. That's their business. But you will not be teaching my son that. And like laid it out. And from that day forward, I was never known as Black David again, and he was never known as Chinese David, at least not in that classroom. But it also, for me, that moment, I think I was frustrated, one, because I got tired of being called Black David, Chinese David, whatever. And also because, like, I like David, but the way you're making it seem is like we're different. Now, like, I don't want to be different from David, right? And so those are the types of instances where, I knew that my mother really loved me, but she also wanted me to be able to love others, right? And to not be this judgmental or this sort of like, guided by influence person, but to be my own person. And so, and there are other instances along the way. The other one that I'll point to is just like, my mother always said anything we wanted to do was possible, and she believed it to the point where I always felt supported, no matter how crazy the thing I was saying was. And Jeff will tell you this, when I applied to his high school, I said I wanted to go to Harvard and study human genetics. I misspelled Harvard. I couldn't even spell. I didn't even know to Google it first, right? Like I think I spelled Hardvard or something along those lines.
Yeah.
It was a crazy dream for sure, right? Like, given the context, but at no point did I think I can't accomplish that. And a lot of that had to do with just like my mother's influence and just her, strength on just like, you can do anything you set your mind to. It's really up to you what you do with your life. And I'm not going to tell you. The other thing is, she never told us what to do. I was never a kid that got in trouble for bad grades. And I was also never a kid that got rewarded for good grades. And so, the years where I was doing great, cool, that's expected. The years where I wasn't doing good, she'd say, hey, look, man, your teacher's saying this or whatever, you need to work at it. But at the same time, like, it wasn't like, you're an idiot, you're never going to be anything. And I had friends who that's what their parents were saying to them when they went home. Yeah. And that just kind of perpetuated and kept things going. My mother always just, like I said, believed in us and really pushed us to dream as big as we wanted to. Whatever we wanted to happen, we could do it.
That was like when my mom said that when I brought home bad grades, she said, if that's the best you can do.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And,
no, but she was manipulating the hell out of me.
We just discovered that.
Yeah, well, my mom was just saying, look, man, you set your pace.
Yeah.
And that's always been important to me. Yeah.
It's interesting. I had a few things, by the way, did you have a follow-up or no? One thing that I found really amazing is that when you said you lived till 13, and then you moved to this other facility, this other area, didn't work out. Like, on some level, there's got to be a transition in your life from there's this life, and now I'm going to this MIT thing, and then I'm going to Harvard. So, like, how are you changing the way you speak? Are you changing the way you act? When are you becoming conscious, like, oh, the behavior here doesn't play well there?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a good one. So the term that folks use is code switching, and like I definitely have like noticed myself doing it. And you mentioned Ivory Tower earlier, which was a documentary that I was able to sort of be featured in when I was in college. And there's this scene, and I don't think it made the final cut of the documentary, but it made the cut that we took to Sundance. And so it was a scene where I was speaking to my grandparents. And my grandparents are both from down south. One is from Arkansas, the other from Mississippi. And so they have very strong Southern accents. And I always grew up in their house. And so I had picked up their drawl, their accent. And I didn't even realize it. But when I'm with them, I speak in such a heavy drawl that the actual crew put subtitles into that scene. When I'm sitting in my grandparents' living room speaking to them, I am almost talking another language to the point where I don't even all the way understand it. I'm like, wow, that's was the mic just missed? Like, I was trying to figure it out, but it's like, no, when I speak with them, when I go over there and just sort of fellowship with them, I speak differently. And it's the same thing when I go back to my neighborhood and I'm seeing old friends or whatever. It's so natural to me. It's second nature. And I don't think it's a bad thing, but I do think that it can be a bad thing on the set of expectations. And the thing that like I liken it to is one of my mentors at some point was asking me, like, when you're in a dining hall at Harvard, where do you sit? And I said, well, I sit with my friends. And he said, well, do you sit with all the Black kids? And I said, well, like, yeah, there are a lot of Black kids. So he said, well, why don't you go sit at some of the white tables? And, when he said that, it was like, that's that code switching thing. That's that expectation. And I'm going to make myself more palatable for you. So instead, I asked him the question, well, why don't they come sit at ours? right? And I think it's really important that people think about that, right? Because it's
obviously
it's easy to walk over to our table as it is for us to walk over to yours.
Yeah, because they're scared because they don't know how to code switch.
But and the other side of it too is they see it as their space, right?
Yeah.
And so we're coming into their space, and so it's on us to make that sort of intro, or that like you when you walk to someone's house, you always say hi, you speak to everyone, and so that's sort of how the expectation is set up. And I was like, that has to break down. Yes, Harvard is an institution that was built for white men, very specifically. That is literally who they were seeking to educate when they built it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that place anymore. It needs to evolve, and so does the students, and so does the people. And that's the same thing in corporate spaces and otherwise. And so, somewhere along college, I started to grow my hair out like this. And I would have mentors say, hey, are you going to cut your hair before graduation? You think it might help you with job interviews? And I was like, look, if a job interview is evaluating me on this, they have no idea what's up here. And that's okay, because I don't want to work for them anyway. Right. Like, it's just like there are certain spaces that I don't want to be in. I'm not going to let you kick my ass so that I can come up to your treehouse. I'm just going to build my own. Right. Yeah. Like that's the confidence that the love from my mother, from mentors and so forth has given me, that I don't have to make myself smaller, softer, more palatable so that the world will see me as valuable. Like, I matter the way that I am. And so, wearing that, living that, letting that be my lived experience and sharing it with others is really important. And this also goes back to labels. I don't mind if someone labels me Afrocentric, as long as they also label me brilliant, right? Like, like, you know what I mean? Like, if those things have to be separated, then that person just doesn't see me, and that's okay. They're that guy.
I mean, the whole thing is, I think that's where I get a little bit frustrated, because if people don't accept that we project by our nature, then it's more, are you conscious of what you're projecting? Right. The problem isn't projecting. The problem is when you project and you have no idea that you're actually blind to assumptions you're making. And that's, that's really the problem. And I think we go to some remedial places to try to heal it. And then there's this whole counter frustration that emerges, of course. Yeah, absolutely. By the way, we had a really Bolalong who's from South Africa. He was also on our show. He's just made a comment.
20 minutes ago.
He's enjoying you and you sharing your past. He also came on the show, and he one of the nicest things was when we started the show, and we kind of went, where do you see the privilege showing up, was one of the first questions we kind of had with him. And he says, the fact that I'm speaking English with you right now. It was like it was one of the best lines of any show. It was like, okay, let's just drop the mic there. Bang.
Right.
It was really beautiful.
And you just made this comment?
Yeah, I said, love your authenticity, your comfort.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would love to sort of segue, because now I've always been fascinated in life, not only your life, I'd say everyone's life, but it's more pronounced possibly in yours, that you've got this old life. You've got the life that you were. Now you go off to Harvard, whole nother environment. No one there for the most part has any exposure to poverty at all, like zero. Yeah. So when you tell a story to them, it's like you're coming from a wholly different planet. Forget about neighborhood. Yep. And then you go on to Microsoft and continue working. And in some ways, there's got to be a tension between this life, which is so much a part of who you are and what you've become, and then this other life, which is in such a contrary world on a lot of fronts.
There is. And I mean, one thing that I've kept perspective on is all one continuous thread, but there are certainly moments where you sort of, you run out of thread on a spool, so you tie on a new thread and you keep it going. And I feel like, Harvard's a good example where once I got to Harvard, I've been so fixated on that goal for so long, right? I mean, like I said, in 8th grade, I sort of had put it out there, and did I know how to make it happen? No, or anything like that. But I sort of had set myself on this path for it. Then once I got there, I was in a place where I was like, what now? Like, really, what do I make of this? And realizing that I now had more freedom and choice than ever in my life, right? Like, even growing up, like, there was only really 2 high schools that I could choose from, right? And I knew I had to go to high school if I was going to go to Harvard. But then, I get to Harvard, it's like, all right, there's a million majors. And like, there's a million different places I go to work. There are a million careers that I could potentially have. The whole world, opened up. And, for a while, I really struggled with, what do I do with this? And I mentioned career and the major as one example, but, then at a high level, right? Like, how does this change that I'm experiencing? How does it impact my family, right? Because, you talk about me going off to Harvard. Well, that doesn't change my family situation. Like, Harvard doesn't pull you out of poverty, right? Like, not just like that. But, one of the so, you're talking about this, and I'm like, look, how do I engage with these, different like lives, as you sort of mentioned them, or these sort of chapters. And it's been something that's been ever evolving. But what I will say is, one thing that made Harvard a really difficult and challenging space for me is I still wanted to bring everything that I was to the table, including this sort of past chapter, or these past chapters and these past life experiences, into my work, into how I framed, ideas and so forth. But, every once in a while, or really, I won't say every once in a while, more often than not, the response from individuals, whether it be peers or advisors or so forth, was very much of the tone, you have survived. You're not there anymore. Now run, boy, run. Right?
Yeah.
Like, very much like separate yourself, move further and further away from this past chapter. And for me, that was never really an option, right? One, I have like, this is my family, right? These are my brothers and sisters. These are people that I'm very close with. I have very strong, loving connections with. There's no running away from that, right?
No.
And then the other side of it was, then how does that change, right? One of the things that I picked up at Harvard that I loved was there's this, choir at Harvard that sings a lot of Negro spirituals and so forth, but they're pretty well renowned. It's called Kumba. And, the director of Kumba would always sort of share what the word means in Swahili. And, everyone has sort of like their own translation. It doesn't have a direct word in English. But the way that they interpret it was to leave a space better than you found it. And, when I thought about, past chapters, it's like, how do I leave this chapter, right? How do I leave this part of my life better than I found it? And what are the pieces that need to, evolve and change? And what's my role in changing them? What's my role in having an impact? And, I just now apply that to everything that I do. Right. That's my goal in life. It's like, every room I enter, how do I leave it better than I found it? Every space, every opportunity I enter, how do I leave it better than I found it? I do that through being authentic. I do that through being honest. Right. I do that through telling and showing who I am, even if it's uncomfortable for others or for myself. Right. There are times where being me is uncomfortable, but I have to do it anyway, because at the end of the day, people need to know that exceptional doesn't mean that I'm the exception, right? It's not an excuse for your bias, right? It's not a free pass on continuing to see a group of people the way that you see them. If you were to talk to me at 8 years old, you would have probably thought that I had nothing ahead of me, right? I'd have been outside doing something crazy, whatever, and been like, yeah, what? If you're that type of person, I should say, obviously, but if you're that type of person and I come in contact with you as a person that I've become, I want to make sure you understand I'm not the exception, right? That's not what it means to be exceptional. There are a number of exceptional people who you just haven't really seen as themselves.
I have an interesting question, and it's kind of has an assumption in it, is that I have this idea that when that was the group, the Harvard group that said, hey, leave the past behind. And now, one thing I'll give a quick analogy. During COVID, I've seen a lot of people go back to their parents' houses. Mm-hmm. And I've seen like they've regressed back to emotional states from the past, because it's like, wow, I thought I was an adult, but now back in the old childhood room, and now I'm still an adult. And I'm wondering like how it is for you, because you've experienced all this stuff, and now you've chosen to leave in Microsoft, where you were at for a few years, and go back to Cleveland. I'm wondering, how is that? Like, where are you seeing like, oh, this is weird, or this isn't comfortable? Like, where is that showing up?
Yeah, it's showing up in a number of places. That's a really good point. Like, I think you're right. Like, a lot of my friends from college and so forth have gone home, and it is a sort of regressive thing, right? Where they're sort of being able to be kids again, so to speak, supported by their parents and so forth. And given that I haven't had that since I was about 14 years old, right? That's just not possible for me. And so the way I've engaged with COVID and sort of the transition and opportunities presented has been wholly different, right? Instead of going back and moving into my parents' house, I actually moved back to Cleveland and bought a house of my own, right? And so this is, bunk beds for my nieces and nephews when they come over to hang out with Uncle Bubba, right? So, for me, it's been an opportunity to engage with my family as an adult, right? And to build and forge relationships with my siblings as adults, right? Because it's been such a long time since I've been in the same space with my siblings for, enough time to really get to know each other as adults. Because I've, been from one thing to another. It was Harvard, then it was Microsoft, now I was traveling, and somewhere in between. Most I've spent at home is 2 to 3 weeks since I was 18 years old, and I'll be 27 at the end of this year. And so, this has been an opportunity for me to actually to evolve the relationships that I have with my family, to make them progress forward, and then also evolve the relationship I have with Cleveland. Because the last time I was in Cleveland, I was sleeping on my best friend's couch, right? The last time I lived here. And so, it's a whole different experience. I mean, I went from homelessness to a house here and a house in Seattle, right? Like Jeff always says, like, you went from homelessness to 2 houses. But, talking about those labels, but that's, it's a different experience.
And a question about kind of continuing on from that question, in some ways, you now are in a financially more comfortable place than where you were, obviously, when you left. And the people where you left probably are still in some struggle.
Yeah. I mean, I remember I had an interview around Ivory Tower for Don Lemon, and he asked me a question, I forget what it was, but I said to him, one of the challenges at being he was like, what's the hardest thing about being an artist? I was like, it's not the classes. It's not, the social environment or anything like that. It's going back home and realizing that things haven't changed, right? And that was really hard for me, because you have this, I think it's Survivor's Guild or whatever. You have this, like, damn, like, things are going well for me, but the world is still in chaos, right? And you don't know how to separate those two things. And so, for coming back and like experiencing, one of the things that's been great about this is, things are changing, and I'm actually able to appreciate the subtle changes that have taken shape and that have happened a little bit more, a little bit better, and then start to think about how I engage with them. And to a great extent, that's why I'm doing the work I'm doing with my new company is, again, I want things to be better for everyone, right? Not for some people, not for people who are privileged to have access to it. I want things to be better for everyone. And so, what are the things that I uniquely add to any conversation that I can sort of, leverage and create, solutions to problems, right?
Yeah. I have another, just segue into the whole nother area. Like, and I think we'll go over a bit on this talk, but there was, going to your brother and his death, right? Like, for Bombos, you might not be aware, but David's brother was shot and killed not all that long ago. And for me, it's like, it's weird. It was like this juxtaposition, your life, and then another life in the same house, raised with you. Like, it's like in your face, like how contrary the future could have been.
Yeah, it very much is. I mean, my brother Darius, when he passed, was 21 years old. And so, that's not something you sort of expect to happen. Like, you certainly don't expect to bury your younger brother. And it's hard, because I think, there's been so many times along the way where I felt so much, hurt to how Darius had experienced life and how it was different, even within the same household, even within, sort of the same sort of context. Darius was always labeled by others as the troubled kid, right?
Mm.
He was always labeled that way. And I remember when I was really young, I would come to his defense, like, you know, he's hyperactive, but he's actually not bad. If you talk to him, if you engage with him, like, no one really understood Darius. They just saw this hyperactive little black boy, and he must needed some medication because he was hyperactive. But then I get around all these, you know, people who have, you know, kids of other, you know, races and so forth. And I'm like, man, like, if they were black, they'd be labeled bad too, right? Like, like if they were, you know, Darius, because they were doing the same stuff, flipping off stuff, jumping off the counters. Like, I'm like, that's just energy. He's expanding energy. So, you know, his labels, though, he carried them, and he carried the weight of them for so long. And the way that he had to interact with the school system and so forth, because once you get that label, they put it in every file to every school you go to, and they engage with you differently because of it. And I always just felt, I knew that was happening, right? I knew that was happening. And I knew there wasn't a whole lot that could be done to change it. But I also knew Darius, right? Like, I knew him, you know, for who he truly was. I could see my brother. And so it was always difficult for me to watch others see him differently, right? And to see his smile fade. I mean, you know, it's wild, you know, because Jeff has known my brother since he was probably, you know, 10 years old or somewhere around there when Jeff met me. And he, you know, recently had to write a character letter for the sentencing of the murderer. And in that letter, Jeff talks about how, you know, when he met Darius, he was like flipping off of the fence in the front yard. He was running around playing football. He was smiling. He was on the scooter. And Jeff saw that smile fade too. And it's like, being his brother and seeing how what were the inflection points that were diminishing for him, and how, you know, it got to a point where it was hard to even intervene with an inflection point to turn things around. And, you know, that's where I just think labels are extremely dangerous, right? I think we are too quick to judge, too quick to label. I think given more opportunity to be Darius, to be himself, and to grow into the person that he could have been, a lot of things could have been different for him. Because, you know, like I said, I look back on it, it's like, I never got labeled the bad kid. I was just a smart kid not living up to his potential. And so, like, there was still an element of hope and how I was labeled. There was no element of hope in the way that the way Darius was being, you know, transported through the system. And I just, it's painful, you know, it's really painful. And then you take how old he was when we became homeless. He was a whole lot less sure of himself at 10 than I was at 14. He was a whole lot less established in who he was than I was. And so going into school and being a kid that only had one outfit and so forth was a lot harder for him in middle school than it was for me in high school, where it was like, man, I just got to do what I got to do. My siblings are good. Like, I had a different perspective and a different maturity. And so it just starts to compound from there.
Yeah. And another thing that, as you speak, you know, I think, I can so imagine that if you go to a nice school and you behave the exact same way. And another thing that I don't think other people could ever imagine outside of the US is that even during COVID, when people aren't going to school, school is where a lot of kids get food.
Yeah, so, exactly.
So, you know, in not going to school, you're actually not getting fed.
Yeah.
And are you aware of that? And that's the biggest thing right now, is that you've got people that would only eat at school, and now they don't have the food because there's no school to go to.
When everything first broke out, I joined a group that was in support of making sure the kids got meals. And so we partnered with restaurants and locals and so forth to make sure that the kids in certain neighborhoods who, you know, had, you know, very high percentages of poverty would have access to meals, until the district eventually figured out a system for it that thankfully is in place now. But it took a while for the district to get all their ducks in a row. They had a lot more restrictions than us. They couldn't just, you know, team up with a restaurant and so forth. But, you know, that's something that, you know, when I was talking earlier about how do I make this space better than I found it, like it's things like that, right? Like I may not be able to solve every problem, but there are certain ways in which we have to engage with the privilege we have now as folks who have experienced that, but now have another opportunity or have a different way of living, come back and engage with the people who are still in that experience. And someday will, find themselves elsewhere, but only by way of really having the supports that they need to get there.
Yeah. It's funny because a lot of the shows that we've been doing have all been kind of congruent with the title of the new book, The Wounded Healer, because it's a weird way, like as we've healed whatever it is we've had to go through in our own lives, then we can be of service to other people that are going through the same.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, I certainly see that in your life.
Yep.
Yeah. We're over our time.
Yeah, that's all good.
It did feel like a very short hour because I feel like there's 20 more questions I could get into, but obviously we'll have to leave that for the next show.
Yeah, we'll come back.
We'll put 2 new labels on you, and then we'll just do the next thing to the next thing, whatever those 2 things are. We'll start it with
progressing. That's it. It's all about progress. As long as things keep progressing, it's all about the progress.
Yeah. I think we'll do it like from high tech entrepreneur to, and then we'll put the other thing to feeding the homeless.
We're gonna do a lot more than that. But thank you both for having me on. I really appreciate it.
For coming on. I really appreciate it. It's nice because I'm often unaware of we do this every day. So I'm often like, hey, I like this guy. I like this story. Let's just throw it together. We'll make it work. And I often forget that, oh, wow, he's probably been riddled with that question 20 or 30 times. And it's each time it's less and less interesting. Right. So thank you for accommodating me on my, working out to meet you and figure out what made sense for us to do together on this show. So
no, definitely appreciate it, Andy. This has been great. I'm glad I had an opportunity to share. So.
Yeah.
All right.
Love you, man. Yeah.
Love you too, Rob.
Yeah. Talk to you. Bye. Oh, incredible.
That was a journey.
Yeah, it really felt like a journey, Yeah. I don't take a lot for granted in my life, but when I hear these stories, I realize, wow, it could have been so different. And I've often, I wrote about it a lot, is that I've often spent time in where am I really a byproduct of my environment and where I didn't even make my own choices, but basically they were made through some sort of strange indoctrination that I wasn't even aware of. And when I see a story like David's, I realize, wow, he would have had his own influences, but he created his own life within that. And I guess I did my own, but I still always kind of linger on I always knew I was going to go to college. All these little things that I took so much for granted because it was so much part of my upbringing. So yeah, it's really, really fascinating. I think that's the kind of journey everyone makes for themselves to see what labels have they adopted, and then in time they get to say, I want to hold that label. Or that's not a label that suits me anymore, and I actually would prefer to move on to another one. And that was a little bit where we got to talk to David. So this is Friday. We came to the end of another week.
Yeah. Thank you.
Show, what are we, 109? We're going to have 110 shows. Thank you, and we'll see you next week then on
Our Wonderful Chaos.
Bye-bye.